The grasslands are quiet before the match. Wind moves through the tall steppe like a slow tide, bending the grass in wide silver waves beneath a sky so large it seems to swallow the earth. Horses stand in restless clusters nearby, their breath rising in pale clouds, their reins tied loosely to wooden stakes. They are the real prize. Hundreds of them. Every animal represents a man who arrived confident and left poorer. In the center of the clearing stands a young woman, with her sleeves tied tight at the wrists. Her posture is loose, almost relaxed, the way seasoned fighters stand when they know the ending before the first move. Around her, warriors gather in a wide circle, princes, soldiers, travelers, men who have come to see whether the stories are true. Across from her, another challenger rolls his shoulders and smiles. He has traveled far to claim her, because the wager is simple. If he wins, he takes the bride. If he loses, he pays 100 horses. The man lunges forward. For a moment the two bodies collide in the dust, muscles locking, boots digging into the grass. The crowd leans in, waiting for the moment strength will decide the outcome. It happens quickly. A shift of balance, a twist of the hips, a sudden, effortless reversal. The challenger hits the ground hard enough to shake the circle of spectators. The woman releases him immediately and steps back, breathing evenly, as if the match barely counted as effort. Behind her, another group of horses is led forward to join the growing herd. The crowd erupts. Some laugh, some stare in disbelief. Others quietly reconsider their own ambitions, because the woman standing calmly in the middle of the steppe is not just a fighter, she is Khutulun, and no one, so far, has managed to win her. Khutulun was born into a world that measured people by what they could survive. The Mongol steppe does not reward delicacy. Winters arrive like blunt weapons, summers stretch endlessly beneath a burning sun. Every day is shaped by movement, horses grazing, camps shifting, warriors riding across distances so wide they make cities feel like cages. This was the world ruled by the descendants of Genghis Khan, where empire traveled on horseback and loyalty was proven in battle. Khutulun's father, Kublai Khan, was one of the most powerful men in Central Asia. A rival to the great court of Kublai Khan, Kublai governed vast territories of the steppe with the kind of authority that only warriors truly respect. Most daughters in royal courts were raised for alliance. Khutulun was raised for survival. She rode almost as soon as she could walk. She learned to hunt, to wrestle, to hold her balance on a galloping horse while arrows flew past her ears. Her brothers trained as warriors, and Khutulun trained with them, not because it was fashionable, but because on the steppe, weakness was simply impractical. Strength became her language. By the time she was older, travelers began to notice something unusual in Kublai's camp. Among the sons who practiced wrestling and swordplay stood a daughter who moved with the same confidence, and often won. Her father encouraged it, not out of indulgence, but pride. Khutulun rode beside him on campaigns. She watched the politics of empire unfold around campfires and battlefields alike. She saw how princes negotiated alliances through marriage and how daughters were used to seal peace between rivals. And she decided something quietly, long before the world noticed. If anyone was going to claim her hand in marriage, they would have to earn it. Not through negotiation, not through titles, but the oldest language of the steppe, strength. And so when suitors began arriving, princes with fine armor, warriors with confident smiles, Khutulun made them a simple offer. Beat her in a wrestling match. Win, and she would marry them. Lose, and they would add another 100 horses to her herd. At first the men laughed. Then the herd began to grow. At first the challenge sounded like a joke. Men laughed when they heard it. Warriors repeated it over campfires with wide grins. A princess demanding a wrestling match before marriage? Surely it was a bit of steppe humor, the kind of boast young nobles make when they're trying to sound impressive. But then, the first challenger arrived, and lost. Word spread quickly across the grasslands. Another man came, stronger, more confident, convinced the first defeat had been bad luck. He lost too. Then came a third, and a fourth. and suddenly the laughter began to disappear. The challenge was no longer amusing, it was humiliating, because the woman defeating these men was Khutulun, the daughter of the powerful steppe ruler Kublai Khan. Every match happened in full view of warriors and nobles. Every defeat meant more than bruised pride. It meant 100 horses changing hands. Horses were not small currency on the steppe. A horse meant mobility, survival, status. To lose 100 was to feel the sting of failure long after the dust settled. And yet, the challengers kept coming. Some came because they believed the stories had grown exaggerated with distance. Others came because pride is a stubborn animal. Many came simply because defeating Khutulun had become the fastest way to earn fame across the Mongol world. The matches always began the same way, a wide circle of riders, boots pressing the grass flat beneath their feet, the wind tugging lightly at loose sleeves. The challenger would bow, confident, certain that brute strength would decide the outcome. Khutulun would step forward calmly. She never rushed, she never shouted, she never needed to. When the two fighters locked arms, the crowd often held its breath for only a few seconds before the inevitable happened. A shift of balance, a twist of the hips, a sudden lift. The challenger would slam into the ground with enough force to shake the watching circle. Sometimes the men lay there stunned, staring at the sky. Sometimes they jumped up immediately, too embarrassed to remain still. Either way, the result never changed. Another 100 horses, another story spreading across the steppe. Soon, Khutulun's herd became legendary. Travelers spoke of thousands of horses grazing under her banners, all won through wrestling matches against men who had once believed strength alone would secure victory. Even distant observers heard the stories. Among them was the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who later described the Mongol princess who could defeat nearly any man foolish enough to challenge her. But Khutulun's reputation was not only built in wrestling circles, because when the camps moved and the war banners rose, she did something even more unusual. She rode to battle beside her father. And there, on the open steppe, her strength proved useful in ways far more dangerous than winning horses. Wrestling made Khutulun famous. War made her respected. The Mongol world was not a quiet one. Power shifted constantly across the steppe as rival Khans fought for land, tribute, and loyalty. Alliances formed around campfires and dissolved just as quickly when armies rode out across the plains. Khutulun did not watch these campaigns from the safety of a palace. She rode with them. Her father, Kublai Khan, was one of the most powerful challengers to the authority of Kublai Khan and the Yuan court in China. Their rivalry stretched across Central Asia, pulling tribes and princes into a long contest over who truly controlled the legacy of Genghis Khan. War on the steppe was fast and brutal. Armies moved like storms across open land, riders disappearing into the horizon before reappearing hours later with prisoners, stolen horses, and news of victory or disaster. Battles were decided by speed, surprise, and the ability to break an enemy's line before they could regroup. Khutulun fit perfectly into this world. She rode with the warriors instead of behind them, her horse cutting across the grass with the same ease she showed in the wrestling circle. Armor and silk did not interest her. What mattered on the steppe was movement, how quickly you could strike, and how quickly you could escape. Chroniclers later wrote something unusual about her. During battles, Khutulun would ride straight toward enemy lines, waiting for the moment when a soldier broke formation or lost balance. Then she would charge forward, seize the man, and drag him back toward her father's troops, like a hunter pulling prey across the grass. It was a maneuver that required terrifying confidence, and it worked. Her reputation spread across the Mongol territories, not just as a strong woman, but as a warrior who could operate in the chaos of battle without hesitation. Soldiers spoke of her with admiration. Enemies spoke of her with caution. In Kaidu's camps, the princess who had once embarrassed princes in wrestling matches now rode beside generals and commanders. And yet the strange part of Khutulun's story remained unchanged. Even as she gained fame on the battlefield, men still traveled across the steppe, hoping to defeat her in the wrestling circle. They still believed that somewhere, somehow, they would be the one strong enough to claim her. And every time a challenger stepped forward, the circle of riders closed again around the grass. The wager remained the same: win the match, win the bride. But the herd behind Khutulun kept growing, which meant the outcome rarely changed. As Khutulun's reputation grew, the wrestling matches stopped being entertainment. They became political. On the steppe, marriage was never just about affection. It was diplomacy in its most practical form. Daughters of powerful families were expected to bind tribes together, calm rivalries, and secure alliances that armies alone could not guarantee. Khutulun complicated this system. Every time a prince arrived expecting to win her hand and left leading fewer horses than he had arrived with, the balance of pride and power shifted a little further out of place. Some men laughed off their defeat, others did not, because losing to Khutulun did more than bruise egos. It raised a dangerous question. What happens when a woman refuses to play the role assigned to her? Her father, Kublai Khan, admired her strength. He had raised her among warriors and watched her grow into one. In his court, Khutulun was not treated like a fragile political asset, but like a trusted companion, someone who rode beside him in war and listened when strategy was discussed. Many even believed Kaidu favored her above his sons. That belief created tension. Princes in the Mongol world were accustomed to inheritance passing cleanly through male lines. The idea that a daughter might hold influence, real influence, made some men uneasy. Khutulun's victories in the wrestling circle were amusing when they embarrassed visiting nobles, but they became far less amusing when her voice began to matter in matters of power. Rumors started to move through the camps. Some said Khutulun hoped to rule. Others whispered that Kaidu might even support such an idea. Whether the rumors were true hardly mattered. On the steppe, perception could shape reality as effectively as any sword. The more Khutulun proved herself stronger than the men around her, the more carefully those men began to watch her. And still, the challengers came. Warriors traveled across deserts and mountains, convinced they could succeed where others had failed. Some arrived with laughter, others with grim determination. But all of them stepped into the circle, believing that strength would finally settle the matter. The circle would close. The dust would rise. And once again, the outcome rarely changed. Another man on the ground, another 100 horses joining the herd. Another reminder spreading across the steppe that the daughter of Kublai Khan was becoming something difficult to categorize. Not a prize, not a political tool, but a force that the Mongol world had not quite figured out how to contain. By now, Khutulun's name traveled faster than the caravans that carried silk and spices across Central Asia. Stories followed the trade routes like dust behind galloping horses. Merchants repeated them in crowded markets. Travelers carried them from one camp to the next. Each retelling made the legend a little larger. A Mongol princess who wrestled princes, a warrior who rode into battle, a woman whose herd of horses was said to number in the thousands. Among the outsiders who heard these stories was the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who later wrote about the remarkable daughter of Kublai Khan. To foreign readers, Khutulun seemed almost mythical, a woman who lived in a world where strength determined reputation and where even noble daughters fought like soldiers. But legends come with a price. The more famous Khutulun became, the more attention she attracted from people who did not admire her. Inside Kaidu's court, politics had begun to sharpen. Powerful families watched closely, calculating where influence might shift after the old Khan's death. Some princes saw Khutulun as a loyal daughter defending her father's power. Others saw her as a dangerous disruption, someone who had stepped outside the boundaries that usually kept noblewomen predictable. A woman who defeated warriors in public, a daughter who rode beside her father in battle, a princess who refused marriage alliances that could strengthen rival factions. None of this fit neatly into the expectations of the Mongol aristocracy. Some began whispering that Khutulun's independence was arrogance. Others warned that a woman with too much reputation could become a threat. Khutulun heard the rumors, of course. On the steppe, nothing stayed hidden for long. Words traveled through tents and camps with the same speed as wind across the grasslands. But she did not retreat. She kept riding beside her father. She kept training with warriors. And when new challengers arrived hoping to defeat her in the wrestling circle, she met them exactly as she always had. Calm, confident, certain of the outcome. Because for Khutulun, the challenge had never been about humiliation or spectacle. It had always been a simple statement. If the Mongol world expected a man strong enough to claim her hand in marriage, then the Mongol world would have to produce one. And so far, it had not. Legends make people curious. Power makes them nervous. By the time Khutulun reached adulthood, she had become both. Across the steppe, men still talked about the princess who could throw warriors into the dust. Her herd of horses had become a kind of moving monument to pride and stubbornness, living proof that challenge after challenge had ended the same way. But the Mongol world was not built only on strength, it was built on succession, and that question was beginning to hover over the camp of Kublai Khan like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. Kublai was aging. His campaigns had stretched across decades, and every prince in his orbit understood that the future would soon be decided. When a powerful Khan dies, the steppe rarely settles into peace. It fractures, alliances shifting like grass under a sudden wind. Some of Kublai's sons believed they should inherit everything. Others believed they deserved a larger share. And in the middle of these ambitions stood a woman whose reputation had grown large enough to disturb the natural order. Khutulun had never asked for a throne, but her influence beside her father had made many people believe she might one day shape the outcome of the succession. That possibility unsettled the men who expected power to flow in a simpler direction. Pressure began to build. Advisors whispered that the princess should marry. Rival factions argued that a husband would help stabilize the political balance inside the family. Even allies quietly suggested that Khutulun's independence had lasted long enough. But the decision, as always, belonged to her. After years of defeating challengers in the wrestling circle, Khutulun finally made a choice that surprised the steppe. She did marry, not because a warrior had finally managed to defeat her. No man had. Instead, Khutulun chose her husband herself, selecting a man she respected rather than one who had conquered her. The decision ended the endless parade of challengers and closed the chapter of the famous wager. But it did something else as well. It reminded everyone watching that Khutulun had never been waiting for someone strong enough to win her. She had simply been waiting until the moment when the decision would belong entirely to her. And even then, the legend did not disappear. Because long after the wrestling matches ended, people across the steppe continued to repeat the same story. About the Mongol princess who had dared to turn marriage into a contest, and about the thousands of horses she won from men who thought strength alone would decide the outcome. Empires tend to swallow people. A generation passes, a ruler dies, and the stories soften. Victories become footnotes. Faces disappear into the long, quiet march of time. But some figures refuse to shrink. Khutulun was one of them. Even after the camps moved and the politics of succession took center stage, the stories about her kept traveling across the steppe. Traders carried them west. Envoys repeated them in foreign courts. Travelers returning from Central Asia spoke of a Mongol princess who had turned the ancient ritual of marriage into a contest of strength, and had embarrassed nearly every man brave enough to try. Among those who recorded the tale was Marco Polo, who described the daughter of Kublai Khan as a woman so powerful that no one could defeat her in wrestling. To audiences in distant lands, the story sounded almost impossible. A princess who fought like a warrior, a woman who rode into battle beside her father, a noble daughter who forced princes to prove their worth, not with titles or alliances, but with muscle and balance in a ring of flattened grass. In the centuries that followed, storytellers kept reshaping the legend. Some turned her into a warrior princess from epic poetry. Others imagined her as the inspiration for characters in foreign operas and novels. Each version changed a detail here or there, polishing the story until it felt more myth than memory. But the core remained stubbornly intact. A woman stood in the center of the steppe. Men challenged her, and one after another, they hit the ground. The image survived because it spoke to something the Mongol world understood well: respect earned through strength. Khutulun did not conquer cities or rule an empire. She did something stranger. She bent the expectations of her world just enough to show that they were never as solid as people believed. And that was enough to make her impossible to forget. History has a habit of smoothing the edges off powerful women. Chronicles grow polite. Details disappear. What once looked like defiance slowly becomes something safer, something easier to explain. But the steppe has a longer memory than most libraries. Across the vast grasslands where empires once rode like storms, the story of Khutulun never needed much polishing. It was already simple enough to survive the centuries. A woman stood in the center of a wrestling circle. Men challenged her, and the ground kept rising up to meet them. That image traveled farther than the borders of any kingdom ruled by her family. Long after the rivalries between Kublai Khan and the court of Kublai Khan faded into history books, the memory of the undefeated princess remained alive in stories told beside campfires and trade routes. Some versions exaggerated the number of horses she won. Others exaggerated the strength of the men who tried to defeat her. But exaggeration only works when it has something solid underneath it. And the solid truth beneath the legend was this: Khutulun had lived in a world that expected daughters to serve politics quietly, and she had refused to do it quietly. She rode where warriors rode. She fought where soldiers fought. And when men tried to claim her as part of a political bargain, she made them step into a circle and prove they could actually earn the right. Very few could. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured, as empires always do. Power scattered across different khanates, and the names of once mighty rulers slipped slowly into the background of history. But Khutulun's name remained strangely resilient, because she had not been remembered for ruling territory. She had been remembered for refusing to be ruled by expectation. And that kind of story tends to outlive the maps that first created it. Empires fade quietly. Maps change. Borders shift. The names of rulers that once filled entire continents slowly become ink in old books. Even the descendants of Genghis Khan, whose armies once thundered across half the known world, eventually watched their empire fracture into smaller and smaller kingdoms. But the steppe itself does not change much. The same wind still rolls through the grasslands of Central Asia. Horses still move across the open plains. Riders still gather in circles where strength is tested and pride is measured in the dust. And somewhere in those long memories lives the figure of Khutulun. Not as a queen who conquered cities, not as a ruler who sat on a throne, but as a woman who did something far more disruptive. She stood in the center of a world built by warriors, and proved she belonged there. She rode beside armies instead of behind them. She forced princes to prove themselves instead of accepting them. And she turned the ancient ritual of marriage into a contest that no one managed to win. In the end, Khutulun did marry, but not because anyone defeated her. She chose. And in a world where power usually moved through men, that decision might have been her greatest victory of all. The horses she won eventually scattered across the steppe. The camps moved. The empire changed, but the image remained. A circle of riders, a challenger stepping forward, and a princess who calmly waited for the moment when the dust would rise. And another man would learn the hard way that strength alone was not enough. History is full of warriors who conquered kingdoms, but every now and then a different kind of legend appears. A woman who didn't need an army to make people remember her. Khutulun did not rule the Mongol Empire. She did something stranger. She bent its expectations. She took a world built on strength and turned that strength into her own test, one that princes, soldiers, and ambitious nobles failed again and again. And that is why her story still moves across the grasslands like the wind. not because she conquered, but because she refused to be conquered. If you felt the wind of the steppe and the dust of the wrestling circle, don't let Khutulun's story ride off into the horizon. History is full of women who refuse to be traded, silenced, or folded quietly into someone else's empire. Subscribe as we continue to exhume the lives of the dark heroines. Next time, we leave the open grasslands and step into the stone castles of medieval Europe. We're meeting the queen who didn't just advise kings, she helped topple one. A woman accused of betrayal, ambition, and treason, because she dared to seize power in a world that believed crowns belonged only to men. Next time, Isabella of France, the queen who overthrew a king. Stay dangerous, stay loud, and never let them hold the pen.